Hey, groupers. I hope that you're ready to dig into the book of Acts, the 11th chapter, the 19th verse. It's exciting to be stuck inside again today because there's so much work going on outside. Finally, it's not raining, and it's not supposed to rain all week. Let's hope that that happens. Let's hope that I don't jinx it. Well, as you get to this passage, I shared with you on Sunday about my life growing up in the Christian church and trying to explain to people that I went to the Christian church. I wonder if you have had a similar experience, and maybe you would share with your group how you explain to people what our church is like, that we're not a denomination, but we're also not really not denominational. We're just a unique little bird. I wonder just how you have explained it. Well, the church is still experiencing persecution. At this point, it's primarily the Jewish people, the Jewish religion, that is persecuting the church. Next thing I'd like you to talk about is, have you ever experienced persecution? Because you're a Christ follower, have you ever experienced persecution? And did that come from another religious group? Maybe you lived in Utah and you were persecuted by the Mormons. Maybe you lived somewhere and you were persecuted by the Catholics. I know growing up as a member of the Christian church in San Antonio, where there were a lot of Roman Catholics, sometimes I got criticized because I wasn't Roman Catholic. I wonder about you. Well, next, we are again reminded about prejudice. It says at the end of verse 19 that the church was going only to the Jews. Have you ever personally, or have you ever been a part of a church that tried to focus on one specific people group? And is that always a bad thing? Now, certainly it is a bad thing if we're being prejudiced, but I remember my home church growing up made a big deal at one point that our church was going to focus on young families. And we hired a children's pastor instead of a youth pastor, and we updated our children's wing instead of updating our youth ministry area. We did everything we could to try to focus on young families. Is that always a bad thing? Have you ever been a part of a church that tried to focus on one specific people group? Well, of course, the famous line in this passage is in verse 26. They were first called Christians at Antioch. I would like you to look up the only other two times that this phrase occurs in the New Testament. It only uses the word to describe the church Christians three times. Here in Acts, and then again in Acts 26, verse 28, and then in 1 Peter 4:16. Of these three occurrences, are any of them positive? I'd like you to answer that question. Or is this name being used as a criticism of the church? And what do you think about the title Christian, little Christ, a little Jesus, somebody that thinks that they're a little Jesus? That's sort of how they use the term. What do you think about that being a negative term? We don't use it as a negative term very much in our country. What do you think about Christian being a negative term? Well, finally, I would like for you to talk about how they were sharing Jesus. There's some mention made by those who dig deeper into this passage that when the men from Cyprus and the men from Cyrene began to share the message with the Greeks, they shared that Jesus was Lord. They didn't share that he was Messiah. They didn't share that he was Christ. At least Luke doesn't say that. Luke specifically said that they shared that he was Lord. Him being Christ or Messiah, those two words mean the same thing. Messiah is the Hebrew word. Christ is the Greek word that both mean Messiah, Savior. It's a very Jewish thing. Well, they're not reaching the Jews now. They're reaching the Greeks. And so they focus on Jesus being Lord, being God. What has been your experience with sharing Jesus with different kinds of folks? What has that looked like for you? Do you have a different way of sharing Jesus if you're talking to a woman versus if you're talking to a man? Do you have a different way of sharing Jesus if you're talking to a child, if you're talking to an adult? Do you have a different way of sharing Jesus if you're talking to a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or someone with some Christian religious background? How do you share Jesus if you're talking to somebody that just doesn't know anything? I wonder what your methods are. Maybe you would just talk about in your small group. What would it look like to share Jesus with a man, with a woman, with a child, with an adult, with someone with some Christian background, someone with some cult background, or no background at all? Well, every week I challenge you to talk about what you liked, just what was your favorite thing in the text. I love that Barnabas didn't forget about Saul. Of course, this is way before the age of social media. It's not like Barnabas and Saul have remained friends on Facebook or Instagram or that they're tweeting each other. Barnabas hasn't forgotten. I really like that. And he goes to find Saul in his hometown, and it takes him a little bit of effort. I really like that. What do I not like? Well, it's not the proudest moment in the church that prejudice is still going on, that they're still just reaching the Jews. But a change is afoot. And then, just to remind you what our application was, I challenged us to be usable. This passage doesn't mention the names of these men from Cyprus and Cyrene. They were just usable. They were used for God's plan, even though their names weren't mentioned. And I thought that was pretty good. Usable, I told you that we would be unstained by our culture, that we would look different than our culture, that we would be stretched to our limits, that being a follower of Christ shouldn't be the easy road, that we would adhere to Jesus, that people would know that we were followers of Jesus. They would call us little Jesus, little Christ, little Christians, that we would be bold in our witness, that we would be telling people that don't know anything about Jesus who he is, that we would be liberal in our giving, and then finally that we would be equipped in the Bible. We would be ready to share. We would be usable. I hope that you have decided to focus on one of those things this week and make some progress. Well, hope that you have a great study, and I'll see you next week. God bless.